They were not supposed to exist. Pale-skinned children, light eyes, European bone structure, discovered barefoot in red Georgia clay, listed as property. In 1871, a county clerk in southern Georgia wrote a sentence that should never have been written. The child appears white, yet is registered as slave-born. That ledger was sealed. The child vanished from records within weeks. And this would not be the last time. Tonight, we descend into a forgotten American nightmare, one that hides behind churches, plantations, orphan registries, and county courthouses. A story buried not because it was unknown, but because it was too powerful to survive daylight. This is not a ghost story. This is not folklore. This is a pattern. And it all leads back to one man. A man whose name was carefully erased, whose influence stretched across decades, and whose legacy was written not in ink, but in bloodlines. What you are about to hear was reconstructed from fragmented archives, missing census pages, testimonies that were never allowed into court, and records that contradict each other in ways that should be impossible. The deeper we go, the more disturbing the question becomes. How many children can disappear before a nation decides not to look? By the 1840s, rural Georgia counties were obsessed with order. Land surveys, church rolls, birth ledgers, slave inventories. Everything had its place, which is why the children stood out immediately. They appeared on plantations far from ports, far from cities, too light-skinned to be ignored, too young to explain themselves. Some had blonde hair. Some had gray or green eyes. Some spoke with accents their caretakers couldn't place. They were never listed as mixed. They were listed as unusual. County clerks used euphemisms: ambiguous origin, defective lineage, unclassifiable youth. But always, the same conclusion was reached. They were property. Local pastors noticed it too. Baptismal records showed children with European names crossed out and replaced with single letters. Entire pages torn from church books. Margins filled with cramped notes that read like confessions written in fear. One minister wrote, "These children are not born of our land, yet they arrive already owned." And then, silence. No follow-up sermons. No recorded concern. The children were placed where questions went to die. Church-run orphan rooms. Apprenticeship farms. Isolated plantations owned by absentee masters. And slowly, a pattern emerged. Whenever one of these children appeared, the same land deeds were nearby. He did not live where his children appeared. That was the first deception. His name surfaced in fragments, never centered, always adjacent. A signature on a land transfer, a donation to a seminary, a quiet benefactor to orphanages that never advertised their residence. He owned property in at least 6 counties. Not contiguous, not profitable by themselves. Strategic. Each property had a church or mission nearby, a small graveyard with unmarked child plots, a history of reassigned laborers. Neighbors described him the same way every time. Polite, educated, not Southern by birth. He attended church but never joined. Donated generously but avoided photographs. Spoke about morality as something inherited, not taught. His personal records are gone, but his children are not. Between 1829 and 1865, at least 37 children matching the same physical description appear across Georgia records, never living past adolescence in official documents. Different mothers, different locations, same handwriting approving their transfer. And every transfer pointed back to him, not as a father, but as an owner. Why wasn't he investigated? Because the system was designed to prevent exactly that. Before the Civil War, lineage was law. After it, silence became law. Children classified as property had no testimony. Orphans had no surnames. Church wards belonged to the institution, not themselves. And this man understood something ancient. If you control classification, you control reality. He funded schools that trained clerks, churches that baptized selectively, judges who ruled on inheritance disputes involving unclaimed minors. When Reconstruction began, his name vanished, but the structures he built remained. Records from the 1880s show something chilling. Children who should have been freed were quietly reclassified as dependents, then relocated, then erased. One archivist wrote decades later, "It is as if the man dissolved into the system and became it." And the children? They stopped appearing in records after age 14. No death certificates, no graves, no marriages, only gaps. In the next chapter, We follow those gaps into orphanages that trained obedience instead of literacy, into churches that preach salvation while rewriting birth, and into testimonies that surface long after everyone who could be blamed is already dead. Because the question is no longer who he was. The question is, what was he preparing them for? By the 1850s, Georgia had a solution for children who did not fit. They called them orphan houses, religious institutions in name, administrative black holes in practice. They were never meant to raise children. They were meant to absorb anomalies. These buildings were placed just far enough from towns to avoid inspection, but close enough to remain funded. Brick structures with whitewashed walls. No playgrounds. No classrooms in the traditional sense. Only dormitories and workrooms. The children who arrived there often had no last names. Some had no recorded birth dates. Many were described in intake logs with a single phrase. Transferred by private authority. That phrase appeared again and again. Children with pale skin were separated immediately, housed in upper floors, assigned stricter routines. Former staff records, written years later in pension applications, describe something unsettling. They were treated as though they were not children, but unfinished things. They were taught scripture by repetition, not meaning. Labor by rote, not trade. Silence as virtue. And always, there were visits. Quiet men in dark coats. Never staying long. Never signing guest books. They asked for no progress reports. Only lists. These orphan houses had schools, but they were not for learning. Children were discouraged from asking questions. Names were replaced with numbers during instruction hours. Writing personal history was forbidden. One rule appears across multiple institutions. No child shall recount origin or speculate upon parentage. Punishments were psychological, not physical. Isolation. Withdrawal of reading privileges. Forced fasting under the guise of prayer. The pale children were often singled out for correction. They were told their appearance was a test, a burden, a temptation. One surviving notebook, found in a church attic in 1932, contains a child's handwriting. They say my face lies. They say God made me wrong on purpose. The notebook ends abruptly. No author name. No age. Just one final line. If I forget myself, maybe they will let me stay. At 14, the transfers began. Always at 14. That age marked the end of childhood in the records, but not adulthood. The children were old enough to understand obedience, young enough to reshape. They were moved under sealed orders. To seminaries. To training farms. To remote estates with no census oversight. Sometimes, 2 children vanished together. Sometimes, entire dormitories emptied in a single night. Staff were instructed not to ask questions. One matron wrote in a private letter. They were taken as though claimed, not adopted. After the transfer, all documentation stopped. No follow-ups. No apprenticeships recorded. No wages. It was as if they stepped outside the concept of citizenship. Churches played their part. Sermons from the era increasingly emphasized ideas of chosen blood, inherited sin, and divine hierarchy. Congregations were told, some souls are born to serve unseen purposes. Some lives are meant to remain unrecorded. Some suffering preserves order. These messages were subtle, wrapped in scripture, delivered slowly over years. The pale children were often seated separately, prayed over more intensely, watched closely. A visiting preacher once remarked, "They look like us, but they are not for us." No one questioned what that meant. Not everyone accepted the silence. In 1884, a schoolteacher in Bibb County submitted an anonymous letter to a regional newspaper. It was never published, but a carbon copy survives. It reads, "Children with European faces are being claimed as property under moral pretexts. They are removed before they can speak freely. I believe a private authority is collecting them." The editor returned the letter with a warning. This topic invites consequences. The teacher resigned weeks later. Her name disappears from census records after 1890. But the letter mattered. Because for the first time, someone said aloud what others only sensed. This was not random. This was harvest. The lie began to fracture in the archives. County clerks in the 1890s noticed something that could not be explained away as clerical error. Genealogical lines that looped back into themselves. Children with no recorded parents were appearing later as witnesses to land transfers. Orphan boys were listed as overseers on properties they should not have known existed. Girls who vanished at 14 reappeared decades later as donors, never residents. of the very churches that raised them. Names changed. Handwriting didn't. The same elegant script appeared again and again, approving deeds, notarizing wills, certifying baptisms. The man was gone, but his pen was still moving. And the children were no longer children. They were placed. What emerged was not a family tree. It was a system. The man had not been gathering children out of impulse or cruelty alone. He was engineering lineage. Each child was placed where they could influence quietly. Church finance boards, seminary administration, county clerical offices, agricultural trusts. They married strategically, never publicly acknowledged relatives, never produced large families. Their role was not expansion. It was containment. One probate judge wrote privately in 1907, "Certain families seem to appear wherever discretion is required." These families had no origin stories, no ancestral graves, no portraits before adulthood. They were genealogical ghosts. And they all traced back, not to a surname, but to properties once owned by the same man. The orphan houses had not erased identity by accident. They had trained compliance without belonging. The children grew into adults who distrusted intimacy, avoided attention, obeyed authority reflexively, felt guilt without knowing why. They were taught to believe they were errors that had been spared. That belief shaped everything. A woman interviewed in 1938, one of the few to speak, said, "I was raised to believe my existence was conditional." She refused to give her name. She worked in county records. She claimed she had been chosen to keep certain truths quiet. When asked who chose her, she answered, "The arrangement." The seminaries were the final refinement. Here, the children learned language. Not poetry, not theology, administration. They were trained in record-keeping, interpretation of law, the power of omission. One lecture transcript survives, unattributed. History is not what happened. History is what remains legible. Students were encouraged to think of themselves as stewards, not participants. Never heroes, never villains. Custodians of silence. In 1919, a federal investigator opened an inquiry into irregular inheritance flows in rural Georgia. He found missing death certificates, churches owning land through shell trustees, orphans listed as beneficiaries without origin. He requested older records. They were denied. The reason given: fire damage. But there had been no fires. Within 6 months, the investigation was reassigned. Within a year, the investigator resigned. His final memo ends with one sentence: "This matter predates accountability." They did not rebel. That is the most unsettling truth. They did not burn buildings. They did not write manifestos. They did not testify. They maintained. They became the quiet machinery that kept things unexamined. And in doing so, they fulfilled the man's final lesson. Power does not need visibility, only continuity. By the 1940s, the pattern faded, not because it ended, but because it no longer needed to recruit. The system was complete. The children had grown into the walls themselves. Every system has a flaw. In this one, it was a town that didn't forget fast enough. By the early 1920s, the town no longer appeared on railway maps. Freight trains bypassed it. Postal routes shortened their stops. Even traveling preachers seemed to pass it by. But the town still had elders. And those elders remembered the children. They remembered pale faces in summer heat. Children who never played freely. Boys who left at 14 and were never spoken of again. One elder said during a town meeting in 1923, "We keep burying memories like their bodies." That meeting was not recorded in county minutes. But word spread. A retired courthouse clerk began copying records at night. Birth entries that contradicted race laws. Transfers signed by the same hand across decades. Marriage records with no parents listed, only witnesses. She kept them in a personal ledger. It was not evidence in a legal sense. It was something more dangerous. Pattern. She showed it to the town pastor, who had inherited sermons dating back to Reconstruction. Margins filled with notes not meant for congregations. The pastor said nothing for weeks. Then he delivered a sermon unlike any before. "There are sins that do not stain the soul," he said, "because they stain the structure instead." Half the congregation walked out. The other half stayed silent. The town was never threatened directly. That was the genius of it. Funding for the school was delayed. A planned road extension was canceled. A bank merger dissolved overnight. No letters explained why. No officials claimed responsibility. People began leaving. Those who stayed noticed something else. Officials who once avoided the town now visited politely, asked gentle questions, suggested rest. One councilman was offered a job in another county, contingent on relocation. He declined. His house burned down 6 weeks later. The fire was ruled accidental. The final meeting took place beneath the church. Old records were laid out on folding tables. The unofficial ledger sat at the center. They planned to send copies north. Universities. Newspapers. That night, the church doors were unlocked. No one knows who opened them. By morning, the basement was empty. No papers. No ledger. No sign of forced entry. The pastor preached the following Sunday, as if nothing had happened. His sermon text was Psalm 88, a psalm without hope. He resigned the next day. By 1935, the town was administratively absorbed into a neighboring county. Its name disappeared from state records. Former residents described a shared sensation, like waking from a dream someone else decided wasn't real. The clerk who copied the records moved north. She never spoke publicly again. But one thing survived. A single page, folded into a family Bible, later donated anonymously to a university archive. It contains a list of names. No surnames. No dates. Just one phrase at the bottom, written in careful script. They were never meant to be seen together. No grave was ever found. That is how the story ends, or rather, how it refuses to end. The man at the center of everything left no burial site, no obituary, no death certificate. It is as if the system he built absorbed him completely. By the time his last known property was transferred, his name no longer appeared. Instead, there were trustees, boards, committees, structures that required no single body to blame. In older cemeteries across Georgia, researchers later found something chilling. Clusters of unmarked child graves. Same spacing, same orientation, no names. The caretakers said they had always been there. By mid-century, the children were no longer visible, because they no longer needed to be. They had become registrars, bank officers, seminary administrators, land surveyors, people who handled information, people who decided what counted. They did not speak of the past because they were trained not to believe they had one. Many never had children of their own. Those who did raised them with an unspoken rule. Do not ask where we came from. Psychologists studying regional trauma patterns in the 1940s noted something unusual: entire family lines with deep anxiety around identity, obedience to abstract authority, emotional detachment without cruelty. The report was filed, then ignored. The system succeeded because it did not rely on secrecy alone. It relied on plausible emptiness. Every missing record had an explanation. Floods, fires, administrative consolidation. Every silence could be justified. Respect, tradition, stability. And anyone who pressed too hard encountered the same response. Not denial, but fatigue. Why dig this up? What good would it do? That was a different time. The greatest defense was time itself. In the late 1940s, a graduate student cataloging rural church donations noticed something strange. Certain family trusts appeared repeatedly across counties, always donating to record preservation projects. Not schools, not charities, records, preserving some things, while letting others disappear. The student wrote a thesis proposal. It was rejected for being speculative. He changed topics. The pattern remained. This story is not about slavery alone, or race, or even power. It is about ownership of origin. The children were not only owned physically, they were owned historically. Their past was taken before they could remember it. Their future was shaped before they could imagine it. And the system that did this never needed to announce itself. It only needed caretakers. So why does this matter now? Because systems that erase quietly do not vanish. They adapt. Because children taught to disappear do not leave ruins. They leave absences. And because somewhere in the ledgers of this country, there are still gaps that feel intentional. Places where names should be. If you walk through certain towns in Georgia today, you may feel it. A sense that something was decided long before you arrived. That history here is carefully shaped, not to reveal truth, but to maintain calm. The children with European faces were never meant to be remembered. That was the final success. But forgetting is not the same as erasing. And sometimes, all that survives is the question history hoped no one would ask. Who benefits from silence?